The cold December winds swept across the mountains of Afghanistan as Soviet tanks rolled through the streets of Kabul on December 24, 1979. The invasion that began that winter would change the world in ways no one could imagine. What started as a Cold War power struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States would accidentally create the perfect conditions for international terrorism to grow. They had done similar operations before, in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. But Afghanistan was different. The rugged mountains, the fierce independence of the Afghan people, and the complex tribal society made it almost impossible to control. Afghanistan in 1979 was already a troubled nation. The country had suffered through years of political chaos. Communist leaders had taken power in a violent coup the year before, but they were losing control. But as the war dragged on, and the Soviets proved harder to defeat than expected, the operation grew massive. The weapons would be shipped to Pakistan, where ISI agents would distribute them to Mujahideen commanders. Young Muslim men from Arab countries, Southeast Asia, and even Europe began making their way to Afghanistan to join the fight. They saw it as their religious duty to help their Afghan brothers drive out the godless communists. Training camps were set up along the Pakistani border, where fighters learned how to use advanced weapons like Stinger missiles that could shoot down Soviet helicopters. By the mid-1980s, the United States was spending hundreds of millions of dollars each year on the Afghan resistance. It became the largest covert operation in CIA history. The foreign fighters brought money, education, and a global perspective. The Afghans provided military skills, local knowledge, and battlefield experience. Together, they created networks that would last long after the war ended. Here was proof that a small group of dedicated believers could defeat a superpower through faith and determination. The Soviet Union, with all its tanks and helicopters and modern weapons, was being humbled by men with rifles and religious conviction. They came from different tribes and regions, but they were united by their opposition to foreign occupation and their Islamic faith. The war that had given their lives meaning was over, but their radical education was complete. They had learned to fight, to organize, and to see the world as a battlefield between Islam and its enemies. They had also built networks of contacts and friendships that spanned the globe. The introduction of American Stinger missiles in 1986 made it much more dangerous for Soviet aircraft to operate. The Afghan conflict had created the first generation of international jihadist fighters, and they would soon look for new battles to fight. Soviet casualties mounted, and public support for the war back home began to crumble. The Soviet economy was already struggling, and the war was costing billions of rubles that the country could not afford. These schools provided education and shelter for millions of Afghan refugees who had fled the war. They built mosques, funded religious education, and supported Wahhabi and Salafi interpretations of Islam that emphasized strict religious observance and the duty to fight enemies of the faith. This religious education created an ideological framework that justified violence in the name of religion. But they also became recruiting centers for the jihad. Young men who might have become farmers or shopkeepers instead learned that fighting was their holy duty. The Soviets began withdrawing their forces, and the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan in February 1989. The Mujahideen had achieved the impossible. It defeated one of the world's two superpowers. They were motivated by religious passion and the belief that they were fighting a holy war. Unlike the Afghan Mujahideen who were fighting for their homeland, the foreign volunteers were fighting for an idea. They believed they were part of a global struggle between Islam and its enemies. The Mujahideen were tough mountain fighters who knew every valley and cave in their homeland. He used his family connections and personal wealth to raise money for the Mujahideen. He established guest houses in Pakistan where Arab fighters could stay before crossing into Afghanistan. He also set up supply lines to bring food, medicine, and equipment to the fighters. They had been fighting foreign invaders for centuries, from Alexander the Great to the British Empire. He arrived in Afghanistan in 1979, just months after the Soviet invasion. Bin Laden was 22 years old, the son of a wealthy construction family with close ties to the Saudi royal family. He had been studying business and engineering, but the call to jihad in Afghanistan changed his life forever. Different groups were fighting for power, and the countryside was in revolt. The Pakistani intelligence service, known as ISI, would distribute the aid and coordinate the resistance. Saudi Arabia would match American funding dollar for dollar, motivated by their desire to fight communist expansion and support their fellow Muslims. The Soviet leaders in Moscow watched with growing worry as their communist allies in Afghanistan struggled to stay in control. When Soviet forces crossed the border, they thought they would quickly restore order and install a friendly government. The invasion sent shockwaves around the world. President Jimmy Carter called it the greatest threat to peace since World War II. The United States had been caught off guard. But American leaders quickly realized they had a chance to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam War. The decision was made to support the Afghan fighters who were resisting the Soviet occupation. These resistance fighters called themselves Mujahideen, which means those who wage jihad or holy war. The American plan was simple but dangerous. The Central Intelligence Agency would provide weapons, money, and training to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. At first, the aid was small and secret. A few $1 million here and there for old rifles and ammunition. The weapons flowed through a complex network. American officials would buy Soviet-style weapons from countries like China and Egypt to hide American involvement. But the Afghan resistance was not just local fighters. News of the holy war against the communist invaders spread throughout the Islamic world. Among these foreign volunteers was a young Saudi millionaire named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden initially focused on providing financial support and organizing Arab volunteers. The foreign volunteers became known as the Afghan Arabs, even though many came from countries other than Arab nations. The mixing of local Afghan fighters with international volunteers created something new and dangerous. Pakistani madrasas, or religious schools, played a crucial role in this process. The Saudi government and wealthy Saudi individuals poured money into these religious schools and the broader Afghan cause. The war created a powerful narrative that would inspire extremists for decades to come. As the 1980s progressed, the Mujahideen became more effective. By 1988, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev had decided that the war was unwinnable. The victory celebration would be short-lived. The foreign fighters who had come to Afghanistan for holy war now faced a problem. These men would not simply return to normal lives. They had been transformed by war and ideology into something new and dangerous. The year 1916 changed everything for Rastafari and for Ethiopia. He was now 24 years old, no longer the curious boy from the mountains, but a confident young man with big dreams for his country. What happened that year would put him on the path to becoming one of the most famous leaders in the world. Emperor Menelik had died a few years earlier, and the crown had passed to his grandson, Ieyasu. But Ieyasu was causing problems for Ethiopia. He was making friends with countries that were enemies of Britain and France during the Great War that was happening in Europe. Even worse, people said he was turning away from Christianity and becoming a Muslim. If Ethiopia sided with Germany and Turkey in the war, the British might decide to invade Ethiopia from their colonies nearby. This could end Ethiopia's precious independence that his father and Emperor Menelik had fought so hard to protect. It was a dangerous plan because, if it failed, Tafari could be killed or thrown in prison. But he believed it was necessary to save his country. In September 1916, the plan worked. Ieyasu was forced to give up the throne, and Menelik's daughter Zudiku became empress. The League of Nations was like the United Nations today, where countries came together to solve problems peacefully. Ethiopia became the first African country to join this important group. This was amazing because it meant that Ethiopia was recognized as an equal partner by the most powerful countries in the world. This made many Ethiopian nobles very angry, because Ethiopia had been a Christian country for over 1,000 years. He had watched, learned, and planned, and now he could finally put his ideas into action. They thought African people were not civilized enough to participate in world affairs. But Rastafari was very smart about how he handled this challenge. He spoke to them in their own languages, showed that he understood international law, and proved that Ethiopia was just as capable as any European nation. Newspapers in Europe and America wrote stories about the brilliant young African leader who was bringing his ancient country into the modern world. People were impressed that someone so young could achieve such an important diplomatic victory. He wanted to make Ethiopia into a modern country that could stand equal with any nation in the world. He immediately began working to bring these modern improvements to his own country. He started by focusing on education because he believed that smart, educated people were the key to making any country successful. This was not like the old Ethiopian schools that only taught religion. This new school taught students about science, mathematics, foreign languages, and world history. He brought teachers from other countries to help Ethiopian teachers learn new methods. This school would later become a university and would educate many of the leaders who would help build modern Ethiopia. They liked the old ways and did not want foreign ideas coming into Ethiopia. Some religious leaders also worried that all these new ideas from Europe might weaken Ethiopian Christianity. He could not push too hard for changes or he might lose his position. But he also could not give up on his dreams for Ethiopia's future. He learned to be patient, to compromise when necessary, and to wait for the right moment to move forward with his plans. Foreign visitors to Ethiopia always asked to meet with him because they knew he was the one who really understood how to deal with other countries. His reputation as a skilled diplomat and a visionary leader continued to grow. He had proven that he could handle international affairs, implement domestic reforms, and maintain the delicate balance of Ethiopian politics. When Empress Zuditu died unexpectedly in April 1930, there was no question about who should become the next ruler. He started a postal system so people could send letters across the country. He even began planning for roads and railways that would make it easier for people and goods to move around Ethiopia. Rastafari saw that Iyasu's actions were putting Ethiopia in danger. He wanted to show the world that Ethiopia could be a truly modern country. She was more traditional and conservative. She did not like many of the changes he wanted to make. Sometimes they disagreed so strongly that it seemed like Ethiopia might have a civil war between those who supported the empress and those who supported the regent. In 1924, he decided to do something that no Ethiopian ruler had ever done before. He would travel to Europe and other countries to see how they lived and learn what Ethiopia could copy to become stronger. He learned about new ways to teach children, treat sick people, and communicate across long distances. He also saw how these countries organized their governments and armies to be more efficient. Working quietly with other nobles, Rastafari helped plan to remove Iyasu from power. Everywhere he went, people came out to see the African prince who spoke perfect French and English and who carried himself like the kings of Europe. He met with presidents and prime ministers, visited factories and schools, and studied everything from hospitals to telephone systems. However, Zuditu was a woman, and many people in Ethiopia believed that women should not rule alone. So the nobles decided that Rastafari would become regent, which meant he would help the empress make important decisions. In reality, this made Tafari the most powerful person in Ethiopia, even though he was not yet the official ruler. Being regent was exactly what Rastafari had been preparing for his whole life. His first big success came in 1923. When he convinced the League of Nations to let Ethiopia join their organization. Getting into the League of Nations was not easy. Some European countries did not want to let an African nation join their club. This success made Rastafari famous around the world. But Rastafari knew that joining the League of Nations was just the beginning. His trip to Europe was like a grand adventure. He visited England, France, Italy, Belgium, and several other countries. The trip taught Rastafari many important lessons. He saw how European countries used machines to make their people's lives easier. When he returned to Ethiopia, Rastafari was full of new ideas. In 1925, he opened a new school called Tafari Makanan School. Rastafari also worked to improve communication in Ethiopia. He ordered the building of telephone lines to connect different cities, but not everyone was happy with all these changes. Some of the old nobles thought Rastafari was moving too fast and changing too many things. The biggest tension was between Rastafari and Empress Zuditu herself. Rastafari had to be very careful during these difficult times. Despite these challenges, Rastafari continued to gain respect both inside Ethiopia and around the world. By 1930, it was clear that Rastafari had become the most important person in Ethiopia. The young man who had started as a curious prince from the mountains was now ready to become emperor of one of the world's oldest independent nations. The morning call to prayer echoed across the sprawling city of Riyadh, as a young man in traditional white robes walked through the marble corridors of his family's business empire. It was 1979. Osama bin Laden had just inherited control of millions of dollars from the Saudi bin Laden Group, one of the largest construction companies in the Middle East, At 22 years old, he was already one of the wealthiest men in Saudi Arabia, but wealth alone was not enough for him. Bin Laden had grown up in a Saudi Arabia transformed by oil money. Almost overnight, the kingdom became one of the richest countries in the world. Oil revenue poured in at a rate that no one could have imagined. The royal family found themselves with more money than they could spend on palaces, cars, and luxuries. When his father Mohammed bin Laden first arrived from Yemen as a poor laborer in the 1930s, the kingdom was still a collection of desert tribes ruled by King Abdulaziz. There were no paved roads, no electricity, and no modern buildings. Most people lived as their ancestors had for centuries, herding camels and goats across the endless sand dunes. Wahhabists believed that Islam had been corrupted over the centuries by foreign influences and innovations. They wanted to return to what they saw as the pure practice of Islam from the time of the Prophet Muhammad. His construction company built the infrastructure that oil money made possible. He constructed highways that connected the desert kingdom to the modern world. They built thousands of mosques and religious schools from Indonesia to Nigeria to the suburbs of London. They paid for scholarships that brought young Muslims to study in Saudi universities. They funded preachers who traveled to remote villages to teach their interpretation of Islam. He built airports where jets could land carrying businessmen and pilgrims. Most importantly, he expanded the holy mosques in Mecca and Medina, earning the eternal gratitude of the royal family. They grew their beards long, prayed 5 times a day, and avoided music and alcohol. The Saudis preferred to fund the most religiously conservative Afghan commanders, particularly those who shared their Wahhabi interpretation of Islam. These groups were willing to use their training camps to teach foreign volunteers not just military tactics, but also radical ideology. He organized charity dinners where wealthy businessmen would compete to see who could donate the most. He collected contributions at mosques after Friday prayers. He used his business relationships to channel corporate donations through Islamic charities. But their emphasis on religious purity and their rejection of other interpretations of Islam made some of their followers receptive to more radical ideas. Everything changed when American geologists discovered vast oil reserves beneath the Saudi desert in the 1940s. The money flowed through a network of Islamic relief organizations, some legitimate and others serving as fronts for militant groups. Saudi religious authorities issued formal declarations that supporting the Afghan Mujahideen was a religious obligation for all Muslims. While the government supported Islamic militants abroad, it maintained close ties with the United States at home. American military advisors helped train the Saudi army. American companies worked closely with the state oil company. The royal family bought their weapons from American manufacturers and sent their children to American universities. They wondered how the kingdom could claim to be the guardian of Islam, while maintaining an alliance with a country that supported Israel and stationed troops in other Muslim countries. These contradictions created tensions that would eventually explode. Saddam Hussein's army was massed on the Saudi border, and intelligence reports suggested he might attack the kingdom next. The Saudi government faced a terrible choice. They could try to defend themselves with their own military, which everyone knew was no match for the battle-tested Iraqi army, or they could ask for help from the United States. Pilgrims performing the annual Hajj pilgrimage would hear sermons about the duty to support the holy war against the Soviet invaders. Religious conservatives saw the American military presence as a violation of sacred Islamic law. They argued that the Holy Land should never be occupied by foreign soldiers, especially soldiers from a country that supported Israel and had fought wars against other Muslim nations. Many returned home convinced that they should contribute money or even join the fight themselves. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were stationed on Saudi soil. For the first time in history, non-Muslim armies were based in the land that contained the 2 holiest sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. He distributed pamphlets and cassette tapes criticizing the government's policies. He argued that the Saudi rulers had betrayed Islam by allowing infidel armies to occupy the Holy Land. He would never return to his homeland as a free man. The Saudi government stripped him of his citizenship and froze his assets. The same religious ideology and financial networks that Saudi Arabia had used to spread its influence around the world were now being turned against the kingdom itself. The kingdom that had nurtured his religious awakening and funded his involvement in the Afghan jihad had become his enemy. His criticism struck a nerve among many young Saudis, who had been inspired by his example in Afghanistan. The pilgrimage became an international networking event for supporters of militant Islam. Most Saudis never supported violence, and many were horrified when they realized what their charity donations had helped create. But the system they had built to promote their interpretation of Islam had taken on a life of its own, creating networks and ideologies that would threaten not just Saudi Arabia but the entire world. They could support their fellow Muslims against communist invaders, while also striking a blow against their Cold War enemy. He had returned from Afghanistan as a hero of the jihad, with a reputation for courage and religious devotion. When the crisis began, he had offered to organize his Arab-Afghan veterans to defend the kingdom against Iraqi attack. The government's rejection of his offer and their decision to rely on American protection instead felt like a personal insult. King Fahd announced that Saudi Arabia would match American aid to the Afghan resistance dollar for dollar. They restricted his travel and monitored his activities, hoping he would quiet down. But his criticism only became more intense. He began questioning whether the Saudi government was truly Islamic at all, suggested that Muslims might have a duty to rebel against rulers who had betrayed their faith. Osama was one of the younger sons, but he showed an early interest in both business and religion that impressed his older brothers. Unlike many wealthy Saudis who simply wrote checks, bin Laden decided to go to Afghanistan personally. He used his family's construction expertise to build roads, tunnels, and bunkers for the Mujahideen. He established guest houses in Pakistan, where Arab volunteers could stay before crossing into Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was perfectly positioned to benefit from this transformation. These teachers told him that wealthy Muslims had a special responsibility to use their money to support their faith. They explained that Islam was under attack around the world and that true believers needed to fight back. When Muhammad died in a plane crash in 1967, he left behind more than 50 children from multiple wives and a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. During his university years at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, Osama had been deeply influenced by professors who taught a strict interpretation of Islam. The version of Islam that dominated Saudi Arabia was called Wahhabism, named after an 18th-century preacher named Muhammad ibn Abdullah al-Wahhab. The Saudi royal family had used oil money to spread Wahhabi teachings around the world. Most Wahhabis were peaceful religious conservatives who simply wanted to live according to strict Islamic principles. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979, the Saudi government saw it as both a religious duty and a political opportunity. Prince Turki al-Faisal, the head of Saudi intelligence, began working closely with the CIA and Pakistani intelligence to coordinate support for the Mujahideen. Osama bin Laden became one of the most important private Saudi supporters of the Afghan cause. More importantly, bin Laden used his connections in Saudi society to raise enormous amounts of money for the Afghan jihad. The fundraising was remarkably successful. Within a few years, bin Laden had raised tens of millions of dollars from Saudi donors. The Grand Mosque in Mecca became a center for Afghan fundraising. But the Saudi role in Afghanistan created dangerous contradictions that would eventually threaten the kingdom itself. This relationship with America became increasingly controversial among religious conservatives in Saudi Arabia. The crisis came in August 1990 when Iraq invaded Kuwait. King Fahd chose to invite American troops to defend the kingdom. Many Saudis were grateful for American protection, but others were horrified. Osama bin Laden was among the most vocal critics of the American military presence. Bin Laden began speaking out against the royal family's alliance with America. The government initially tried to reason with bin Laden. In 1991, under intense government pressure, bin Laden left Saudi Arabia for Sudan. The break between bin Laden and Saudi Arabia was more than a personal dispute. It represented a fundamental contradiction in the kingdom's policies. The Saudi connection to international terrorism was complex and often unintentional. In February 1989, the last Soviet soldier walked across the Friendship Bridge from Afghanistan into Uzbekistan. Lieutenant General Boris Gromov paused at the border and looked back at the country that had become the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Behind him, he left a devastated nation and thousands of foreign fighters who had come from around the world to wage holy war against the communist invaders. They called themselves the Afghan Arabs, though many were not actually Arab. What united them was not ethnicity, but ideology. They had answered the call to jihad and helped defeat one of the world's superpowers. They had been transformed by their experience in Afghanistan. They had learned to fight, to organize, and to see the world as a battlefield between Islam and its enemies. They had built networks of friendship and loyalty that spanned continents. But they no longer had a war to fight. For 10 years, these volunteers had poured into Afghanistan and Pakistan from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Yemen, and dozens of other countries. Different mujahideen groups immediately began fighting each other for control of the country. The unity that had existed during the war against the Soviets quickly collapsed into brutal civil war. His former classmates were focused on finding jobs, getting married, and buying cars. They talked about soccer matches and television shows. They seemed to have forgotten that Muslims were suffering in Palestine, Kashmir, and other occupied lands. But he could not forget what he had experienced in Afghanistan. He had tasted the excitement of jihad and felt the brotherhood of men willing to die for their beliefs. Normal life seemed meaningless in comparison. Foreign fighters found themselves caught in the middle of conflicts they did not understand between Afghan factions they had once supported. In Egypt, President Hosni Mubarak's government arrested hundreds of returning Afghan veterans. Many were tortured in prison. The Egyptian authorities had good reason to be worried. Some of the returnees had indeed been radicalized by their experience and were planning to use their new skills against the Egyptian government. Intelligence officers questioned them about their activities and monitored their movements. Some were arrested on charges of supporting terrorism or planning to overthrow the government. The men who had been heroes of the jihad found themselves treated as potential criminals. The Egyptian security forces were well-trained and ruthless in their pursuit of militants. By the mid-1990s, al-Zawahiri's organization had been largely destroyed. Many of its members were dead or in prison. Al-Zawahiri himself was forced to flee the country, joining other Afghan veterans in exile around the world. They saw it as proof that there was a global conspiracy against Islam. The same. Western countries that had supplied them with weapons to fight the Soviets now treated them as terrorists. This contradiction convinced many veterans that the West had never been their ally, only a temporary partner of convenience. Western governments had supported the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Soviets. But they did not want battle-hardened militants living in their cities. Many countries refused to give visas to men who had fought in Afghanistan. Many simply wanted to continue the work. They had started in Afghanistan. They established charities and relief organizations that claimed to help Muslim communities around the world. Some of these groups were legitimate humanitarian organizations. Others were fronts for militant activities. Others monitored them closely or deported them at the first sign of trouble. They were part of a network that transcended national boundaries. They shared common experiences, beliefs, and contacts that made them far more dangerous than their numbers suggested. Young Muslims from around the world continued to travel there for training, even though the war against the Soviets was over. The camps now prepared fighters for conflicts in Bosnia, Chechnya, and other battlefields where Muslims were fighting. After Saddam's assassination in 1989, control of the organization passed to Osama bin Laden. He transformed it from a support network for the Afghan jihad into the foundation for a global terrorist organization that would eventually be known as Al-Qaeda. The network that had been created to wage one war was about to start many others. The skills that had been used to fight Soviet soldiers in the mountains of Afghanistan were adapted for urban terrorism in New York, London, and other major cities. The network that had once channeled volunteers to fight a conventional war began recruiting suicide bombers for attacks against civilians. The Afghan alumni were not traditional terrorists focused on single countries or specific political goals. They were part of an international movement that saw the entire world as their battlefield. They had been trained, networked, and ideologically prepared for a global war that most people did not even know had begun. When conflict broke out in Bosnia in the early 1990s, hundreds of veterans traveled to the Balkans to help their fellow Muslims. They brought with them the military skills they had learned in Afghanistan and the radical ideology they had absorbed in training camps. But the foreign volunteers also brought problems. They insisted on fighting according to their own strict interpretation of Islamic law. They clashed with local commanders who had different ideas about how the war should be conducted. He returned to Egypt convinced that the government of Hosni Mubarak was an enemy of Islam that needed to be overthrown. He helped organize a campaign of terrorism against government officials, tourist sites, and Coptic Christians. They joined separatist movements in the Philippines and Kashmir. They participated in civil wars in Algeria and Tajikistan. Wherever Muslims were fighting, the alumni of the Afghan jihad seemed to appear. A doctor from a prominent Cairo family, al-Zawahiri, had been involved in radical politics since his teenage years. He had spent 3 years in Egyptian prisons in the 1980s, before traveling to Fusadan to work as a medic with the Mujahideen. Now the war was over, and they faced a problem that would have consequences for decades to come. The end of the Soviet occupation did not bring peace to Afghanistan. He dropped out of university and traveled to Pakistan to join the fight against the Soviets. For 2 years, he learned to use weapons, build bombs, and live in the harsh mountains of Afghanistan. He fought in several battles and watched friends die for their faith. Many of the Afghan Arabs decided it was time to go home. They packed their few belongings and began the long journey back to their countries of origin. But when they arrived, they discovered that home was not the same place they had left years earlier. More importantly, they were not the same people who had left. Ahmad al-Nami had been a quiet engineering student in Saudi Arabia. When he first heard about the Afghan Jihad in 1987, when al-Nami returned to Saudi Arabia in 1990, he found a country that seemed alien to him. Al-Nami tried to readjust to civilian life. He finished his engineering degree and found work with a construction company. The Saudi government was also suspicious of returning Afghan veterans. Similar scenes played out across the Muslim world. Man al-Zawahiri was one of those Egyptian veterans who came back from Afghanistan with revolution on his mind. In Afghanistan, al-Zawahiri had met Osama bin Laden and other influential figures in the international jihadist movement. But Egypt was not Afghanistan. The Afghan alumni found that they were not welcome in most countries. This rejection by the international community only reinforced the worldview that the veterans had developed in Afghanistan. Some of the Afghan alumni found new wars to fight. The Bosnian government initially welcomed this foreign assistance. They were desperate for experienced fighters who could help defend Muslim civilians against Serbian and Croatian forces. Similar patterns emerged in other conflicts around the world. Afghan veterans appeared in Chechnya to fight against Russian forces, but not all of the veterans were looking for new wars. The most important of these organizations was the Services Bureau that Abdullah Azam had established during the Afghan War. Bin Laden understood something that many governments missed. The Afghan veterans were not just individual militants who could be defeated through arrest or deportation. The guest houses that bin Laden had established in Pakistan during the war became permanent institutions. More dangerously, some camps began training operatives for terrorist attacks against Western targets. By the mid-1990s, intelligence agencies around the world were beginning to realize they faced a new kind of threat. The men who had once been celebrated as freedom fighters against Soviet oppression were now planning attacks against the very countries that had supported them. In the spring of 1991, a private jet touched down at Khartoum International Airport in Sudan. Among the passengers stepping out into the blazing desert heat was Osama bin Laden, now a man without a country. The Saudi government had made it clear that he was no longer welcome in his homeland. His criticism of the royal family's alliance with America had made him too dangerous to ignore. Sudan in 1991 was exactly the kind of place where a wealthy militant could disappear and rebuild. The country was ruled by Omar al-Bashir, a military officer who had seized power in 1989 with the support of Islamic fundamentalists. Here were experienced fighters and wealthy donors who could help him achieve his dreams of Islamic revolution. In return, he offered them something they desperately needed: a safe place where they could organize, train, and plan without interference from hostile governments. His companies employed thousands of local workers and earned millions of dollars in government contracts. On the surface, he looked like a successful businessman who was helping to develop a poor African country. Al-Bashir's government was transforming Sudan into what they called a pure Islamic state. Based on their interpretation of religious law, traditional terrorist groups were usually focused on specific countries or causes. The Irish Republican Army wanted to drive the British out of Northern Ireland. The Palestine Liberation Organization wanted to destroy Israel and create a Palestinian state. These groups had clear, limited goals. Despite his Western education, al-Turabi had become convinced that Islam and Western civilization were locked in an eternal struggle. He wanted to make Sudan into a base for spreading Islamic revolution throughout Africa and the Middle East. It was not focused on any single country or conflict, but he also raised money from wealthy donors throughout the Islamic world. Islamic charities, many of them legitimate humanitarian organizations, unknowingly transferred money to al-Qaeda front companies. Instead, It saw itself as the foundation for a global Islamic revolution that would eventually encompass the entire world. It had subsidiaries and franchises in dozens of countries. It maintained training camps, safe houses, and weapons depots on multiple continents. It recruited operatives from universities and mosques around the world, trained them in Sudan or Afghanistan, and then sent them back to their home countries to establish terrorist cells. The organization set up cells in Kenya and Tanzania, where they would later bomb American embassies. They established training camps in Somalia, where they taught local warlords how to fight American peacekeeping forces. His businesses provided jobs and tax revenue. His connections brought other wealthy investors to Sudan. Al-Turabi used bin Laden's money and influence to host conferences that brought together Islamic militants from around the world. Militants who had never met before discovered they had common enemies and similar goals. They shared information about weapons, tactics, and targets. They formed alliances that would last for decades. Western countries began imposing economic sanctions on Sudan, claiming it was supporting terrorism. European countries restricted trade and froze Sudanese assets. They threatened to cut off aid to Sudan and encouraged other Gulf countries to do the same. For a poor country like Sudan, losing access to Gulf oil money was a serious threat. The Palestinian terrorist Carlos the Jackal lived in Sudan under government protection. In 1996, American officials gave al-Bashir an ultimatum: expel bin Laden or face military action. The Mujahideen groups that had defeated the Soviets were now fighting each other in a brutal civil war. Cities were in ruins. Millions of people had fled to refugee camps in Pakistan. The country seemed to be falling apart. The Americans had been monitoring al-Qaeda's activities in Sudan and knew that the organization was planning attacks against American targets. Here was a government that truly believed in creating an Islamic state according to religious law. They were not corrupted by Western ideas or compromised by deals with foreign powers. They were exactly the kind of rulers that Islamic theorists like Sayyid Qutb had dreamed about. But he gave the al-Qaeda leader advance warning, allowing him to transfer money out of the country and make arrangements for his departure. In May 1996, bin Laden and his closest associates boarded a chartered plane and flew to Afghanistan. They needed money to continue their war against rival Mujahideen groups. Bin Laden's wealth and international connections could help them gain control of the entire country. In exchange, they were willing to give al-Qaeda something even more valuable than Sudan had provided: complete freedom to operate without interference. They were no longer willing to tolerate Sudan's support for terrorism. Young militants from around the world began arriving in Afghanistan to learn the skills of terrorism. The remote mountains and deserts of Afghanistan became the new headquarters for a global war that most people did not even know had begun. The attack failed, but Egyptian investigators quickly traced the plot back to Sudan. The Egyptian government demanded that Sudan expel bin Laden and other militants. When al-Bashir refused, Egypt began supporting rebel groups in southern Sudan. They imposed harsh rules based on their understanding of Islamic law. Men were required to grow beards. Women were forbidden to work or go to school. Music and television were banned. Thieves had their hands cut off. Adulterers were stoned to death. They sent money and weapons to Islamic militants in Algeria, Egypt, and the Philippines. The man behind this transformation was Hassan al-Turabi, a brilliant scholar who had studied at the Sorbonne in Paris and Harvard University in America. He used his legitimate businesses as a cover for building a terrorist organization. The construction sites where his workers built roads by day became training camps where militants learned to make bombs by night. Bin Laden's construction companies in Sudan were profitable. He owned farms that exported agricultural products to Europe. He had investments in banks, import-export companies, and even a tannery that processed leather. These businesses provided both income and cover for terrorist activities. The bank accounts he used for business transactions also funded arms purchases and payments to terrorist cells around the world. Al-Turabi welcomed bin Laden and other Afghan veterans to Sudan with open arms. The country bordered 8 other nations, including Egypt, Libya, and Ethiopia. Operatives could easily cross these borders without detection. Khartoum's airport had flights to destinations throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Money and weapons could be moved easily through Sudan's banks and ports. Bin Laden quickly made himself at home in Sudan. He used his construction expertise to build roads, bridges, and irrigation systems for the Sudanese government. But bin Laden's real work in Sudan was much more dangerous. The organization that bin Laden built in Sudan was unlike anything the world had seen before. Bin Laden's organization was different. He called it Al-Qaeda, which means the base, or the foundation in Arabic. Al-Qaeda operated more like a multinational corporation than a traditional terrorist group. The financial structure of Al-Qaeda was equally sophisticated. Bin Laden used his personal fortune, estimated at over $300 million, to fund the organization's operations. The organization also made money through legitimate businesses. Sudan's location made it perfect for Al-Qaeda's global operations. During bin Laden's 5 years in Sudan, Al-Qaeda established a presence in countries around the world. The Sudanese government benefited enormously from bin Laden's presence. His construction projects improved the country's infrastructure. These conferences turned Khartoum into the center of international terrorism. But bin Laden's presence in Sudan also created problems for al-Bashir's government. The pressure intensified after al-Qaeda operatives attempted to assassinate Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak during a visit to Ethiopia in 1995. Saudi Arabia also pressured Sudan to expel bin Laden. The kingdom froze his assets and revoked his citizenship, making him officially stateless. The final blow came from the United States. Faced with this pressure, al-Bashir reluctantly agreed to expel bin Laden. The Afghanistan that bin Laden returned to in 1996 was very different from the country he had left years earlier. But one group was bringing order to the chaos. The Taliban had already conquered most of southern Afghanistan by the time bin Laden arrived. The Taliban welcomed bin Laden's return for practical reasons. Within months of his arrival, bin Laden was rebuilding the training camps that had been destroyed during the Civil War. In a small apartment in Cairo during the summer of 1991, a group of young Egyptian men gathered around a television set watching news footage that would change their lives forever. On the screen, they saw American cruise missiles striking targets in Iraq during the Gulf War. The commentator explained that the United States was leading an international coalition to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. As to most Americans watching the same footage, the war looked like a clear case of good versus evil. Saddam Hussein had invaded a small, peaceful country, and the United States was helping to restore justice. The war was quick, successful, and seemed to prove that American military power could be used to make the world a better place. They grew from a complex mix of historical grievances, religious beliefs, and political frustrations that radical leaders like bin Laden and al-Zawahiri skillfully exploited to build support for their cause. But the young men in Cairo saw something completely different. They saw American weapons destroying an Arab country. Since Israel's creation in 1948, the United States had provided billions of dollars in military and economic aid to the Jewish state. American weapons had been used in every major Arab-Israeli war. Every Israeli settlement built on Palestinian land was constructed with American money. Young Muslims who had never been to Palestine saw these children as their brothers and sisters. They wondered why America, which claimed to support freedom and democracy, was helping to oppress an entire people. Every Palestinian killed by Israeli soldiers died from American bullets. American diplomats had consistently supported Israeli positions in international negotiations. For Muslims, Saudi Arabia was not just another country. It contained the two holiest sites in Islam, the Great Mosque in Mecca, where the Prophet Muhammad had received his first revelations, and the Prophet's mosque in Medina, where he was buried. The fact that American soldiers, many of them women, were based just a few hundred miles from Mecca felt like a deliberate insult to Islamic values. Radical preachers described the American presence as a new form of crusade. Comparing it to the medieval Christian invasions of the Holy Land, the United States supported authoritarian rulers like Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, the Saudi royal family, and the Shah of Iran before his overthrow in 1979. These leaders often used American weapons and training to suppress their own people. They saw foreign armies occupying the Holy Land of Saudi Arabia. They concluded that American talk about democracy was hypocritical, and that the United States only cared about controlling Middle Eastern oil resources. In his telling, all of these problems stemmed from a coordinated American assault on Islam, the support for Israel, the troops in Saudi Arabia, the sanctions on Iraq, and the backing for dictators were all part of the same strategy. They saw the United States using its military might to impose its will on the Islamic world. What Americans called liberation, they called occupation. Muslims would not need to reform their societies, improve their economies, or resolve their internal conflicts. They just needed to drive out the Americans and their allies. Preachers in London, Jakarta, Cairo, and Karachi told their congregations about American crimes against Muslims. Students in religious schools learned that America was the enemy of their faith. Young men in refugee camps were taught that violence against Americans was not just permitted, but required by Islam. Why were Muslim countries poor and weak while Western countries were rich and strong? Because America was waging war against Islam. Why were Muslims suffering in Palestine, Kashmir, Chechnya, and other places? Al Jazeera and other Arabic-language news channels broadcast images of Palestinian children killed by Israeli soldiers and Iraqi babies dying from lack of medicine. Websites and chat rooms allowed militants to share propaganda and coordinate activities across continents. These immigrants and their children often faced discrimination and economic hardship in their new homes. They watched their adopted countries support policies that seemed to harm their countries of origin. They felt caught between two worlds, fully accepted in neither, because America and its allies were trying to destroy the Islamic faith. Millions of Muslims around the world felt that America was their enemy, even if they would never personally engage in violence. This provided the sea in which terrorist fish could swim, to use Mao Zedong's famous phrase about guerrilla warfare. All that remained was for bin Laden to find the means and opportunity to strike at the heart of American power. Al-Zawahiri had already been radicalized by his experiences in Egyptian prisons and Afghan training camps. But the Gulf War convinced him that America was the real enemy of Islam. They had convinced many, the Muslims, that terrorism was not just politically justified, but religiously required. They had created the ideological foundation for a conflict that would reshape the world in ways that no one could have imagined. American officials genuinely believed they were promoting stability and prosperity in the Middle East. They saw their support for Israel as backing the only democracy in a region of dictatorships. They viewed their alliance with Saudi Arabia as necessary to ensure stable oil supplies for the global economy. He had grown up as part of the Saudi elite and had seen firsthand how American companies and diplomats worked with corrupt Arab rulers. Instead of trying to integrate into societies that seemed to reject them, they could join a global struggle that gave their lives meaning and purpose. They could become soldiers in a holy war against the country that had given them citizenship but not belonging. He had watched Palestinian refugees in the camps around Peshawar during the Afghan War. He had heard countless stories of humiliation and injustice from fighters who came from across the Islamic world. They did not care about oil markets or regional stability. They measured American actions not by American intentions, but by their impact on Muslim communities. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright once said that the deaths of Iraqi children were a price worth paying to contain Saddam Hussein. Too many Muslims, this statement proved that America did not value Arab or Muslim lives. The sanctions were designed to prevent Saddam Hussein from rebuilding his military, but they also caused immense suffering for ordinary Iraqi civilians. International agencies estimated that hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children died from malnutrition and disease, because the sanctions prevented Iraq from importing food and medicine. Among the men watching that night was Ayman al-Zawahiri, the Egyptian doctor who had spent years fighting in Afghanistan and would later become Osama bin Laden's closest advisor. The anti-American feelings that spread through the Islamic world during the 1990s did not emerge from nowhere. The most emotional issue for many Muslims was American support for Israel. For Palestinians living under Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, American support for Israel meant that their suffering would continue indefinitely. The images of Palestinian children throwing stones at Israeli tanks became symbols of resistance throughout the Islamic world. The presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia after the Gulf War created even deeper anger among religious conservatives. Islamic law traditionally prohibited non-Muslims from even entering these holy cities, let alone stationing armies nearby. The economic sanctions imposed on Iraq after the Gulf War provided another source of anti-American anger. When American officials were asked about these deaths, they sometimes gave answers that seemed callous to people in the region. The broader pattern of American foreign policy in the Middle East also fueled resentment. Young Muslims who wanted democracy and human rights in their countries found that America despite its rhetoric about freedom, consistently supported dictators who served American interests. Osama bin Laden understood these grievances better than most Western leaders. Bin Laden's genius was his ability to weave these separate grievances into a single narrative that explained everything wrong with the Muslim world. This narrative was powerfully seductive because it provided simple answers to complex questions. The narrative also provided a clear solution. If America was the source of all problems, then defeating America would solve everything. Bin Laden's message spread through a network of mosques, religious schools, and charitable organizations that reached across the Islamic world. The internet and satellite television made it easier to spread this message. The message found particularly receptive audiences among Muslims living in Western countries. For some of these Western Muslims, bin Laden's narrative provided a way to resolve their identity crisis. The American government was slow to understand how its foreign policies were being perceived in the Islamic world. But these rational calculations meant nothing to young Muslims who saw only the results of American policies. By the late 1990s, this anger had created a vast pool of potential recruits for terrorist organizations. Bin Laden and his associates had successfully transformed specific political grievances into a religious war between Islam and America. The stage was now set for the escalation that would culminate in the September 11th attacks. In a dimly lit internet cafe in London during the summer of 1998, a young man with a thick beard typed carefully on a worn keyboard. His name was Abu Hamza, and he was creating what would become one of the first jihadist websites. The simple page contained religious texts, audio recordings of sermons, and most importantly, instructions for how young Muslims could travel to training camps in Afghanistan. Abu Hamza had no idea that he was helping to revolutionize terrorism. The internet was still new to most people in 1998. Many families did not even own computers, and those who did connected through slow dial-up modems that took minutes to load a single photograph. If a militant in London wanted to coordinate with allies in Pakistan, he had to send letters that took weeks to arrive and could be intercepted by intelligence agencies. If he wanted to transfer money, he had to rely on banks that kept detailed records of every transaction. But Abu Hamza understood something that many government officials missed. This new technology would change everything about how terrorist organizations operated. The training camps that al-Qaeda established in the Afghan mountains were equipped with satellite phones, laptop computers, and encryption software. Recruits learned not just how to fire weapons and build bombs, but also how to communicate securely and transfer money without detection. These sites contained sermons, religious texts, and news articles about Muslims suffering around the world. Buried within the religious content were contact addresses and coded messages that allowed potential recruits to make contact with al-Qaeda operatives. During his years in Sudan in the early 1990s, he had invested heavily in telecommunications companies and computer equipment. In the past, militant groups had relied on written pamphlets and audio recordings to spread their message. These media could convey ideas but could not show the human suffering that motivated people to join radical causes. Construction business used satellite phones to coordinate projects across the vast African country. When authorities shut down one site, several others would appear within days. The decentralized nature of the internet made it almost impossible for any government to completely block al-Qaeda's online presence. These Arabic language channels reached hundreds of millions of viewers across the Middle East and North Africa. When bin Laden wanted to communicate with his supporters or threaten his enemies, he could simply send a videotape to Al Jazeera and know that it would be broadcast within hours. His financial network relied on electronic banking to move money between accounts in different nations. Money donated by well-meaning Muslims to help Afghan orphans or Palestinian refugees was diverted to fund terrorist training camps and weapons purchases. The complex web of international banking made it almost impossible for investigators to trace these transactions. Islamic banking networks, originally created to serve legitimate religious and commercial needs, became channels for moving terrorist funds. The Hawala system, an informal money transfer network based on trust and family connections, allowed operatives to move large sums across international borders without leaving paper trails. A single operative with access to funding could purchase airline tickets, rent apartments, and buy supplies in any country without needing direct contact with al-Qaeda leadership. This reduced the risk of the entire network being compromised if one cell was discovered. The 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center had required extensive meetings between conspirators, creating opportunities for law enforcement surveillance. By the late 1990s, terrorists could plan similar attacks using only electronic communications, making them much harder to detect and prevent. Just 20 years earlier, terrorists had been limited by the same communication problems that had constrained human activity for centuries. Sophisticated computer programs could scramble messages so thoroughly that even the most powerful government computers could not decode them. By the late 1990s, detailed instructions for creating explosives, conducting surveillance, and planning attacks were available on websites that anyone could access. Operatives learned to hide encrypted files inside innocent-looking photographs or music files that could be transmitted without suspicion. These platforms allowed operatives to identify potential recruits based on their online activities and political statements. They could gradually introduce radical ideas to susceptible individuals through private messages and targeted content. A bomb maker in Afghanistan could provide technical advice to a cell in Germany through encrypted chat rooms. Veterans of the Afghan War could share tactical knowledge with young radicals in London or New York. The same tools that allowed corporations to operate globally and governments to communicate instantly were enabling terrorist organizations to plan attacks of unprecedented scale and sophistication. The internet created a virtual training camp that operated 24 hours a day in every country with internet access. In the past, planning a major attack might take years of careful preparation and slow coordination between distant cells. It combined ancient religious ideology with cutting-edge technology, traditional recruitment methods with internet propaganda, and local grievances with global coordination. The stage was set for an attack that would demonstrate just how dangerous this combination could be. By the late 1990s, Al-Qaeda could plan and execute sophisticated operations in a matter of months or even weeks. The technological revolution of the 1990s swept away these limitations almost overnight. Software that had once required expensive equipment and technical expertise became available to anyone with a laptop computer. Operatives could create false identity documents, plan attacks using mapping software, and research targets using commercial databases. Satellite phones allowed instant communication between continents. The internet enabled secure messaging and file sharing across the globe. They could record interviews with militants explaining why they had joined the Holy War. Previous terrorist groups had been limited to specific regions or countries. Al-Qaeda could recruit in London, train in Afghanistan, plan in Germany, and attack in New York, all while maintaining secure communications and coordination throughout the process. Most powerfully, they could document their own attacks and distribute the footage worldwide within hours. International banking networks made it possible to move money anywhere in the world within hours. Suddenly, a terrorist organization could operate like a multinational corporation, coordinating activities across dozens of countries in real time. The attacks were coordinated using satellite phones and encrypted messages. The operatives used false identities and electronic banking to move money and purchase supplies without detection. Within hours of the explosions, Al-Qaeda websites were distributing video footage of the destruction, along with statements claiming responsibility. Osama bin Laden was one of the first terrorist leaders to fully understand the potential of these new technologies. When bin Laden returned to Afghanistan in 1996, he brought this technological expertise with him. The internet became Al-Qaeda's most powerful recruitment tool. The organization created dozens of websites that appeared to be religious or charitable organizations. The websites were hosted on servers in different countries and frequently changed their addresses to avoid detection by law enforcement. Video technology gave terrorist propaganda unprecedented emotional impact. Digital video cameras changed this completely. Al-Qaeda operatives could now film the destruction caused by American bombing in Iraq, or the poverty in Palestinian refugee camps. The 1998 bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania demonstrated Al-Qaeda's sophisticated use of technology. Satellite television networks like Al Jazeera amplified Al-Qaeda's message far beyond what the internet alone could achieve. The global financial system provided even more opportunities for terrorist exploitation. Al-Qaeda established front companies and charitable organizations in dozens of countries. Credit cards and electronic payment systems made it easier for terrorist cells to operate independently. Encryption technology allowed Al-Qaeda to communicate securely, even when intelligence agencies were monitoring their activities. The personal computer revolution put advanced capabilities into the hands of individual terrorists. Cell phones and pagers enabled terrorist cells to coordinate complex operations without meeting face-to-face. The internet also democratized terrorist training. In the past, aspiring militants had needed to travel to training camps in Afghanistan or other remote locations to learn bomb-making and other skills. Online forums allowed experienced terrorists to mentor newcomers without ever meeting them. Social media platforms that emerged in the early 2000s provided even more sophisticated tools for terrorist recruitment and coordination. The speed of modern communications also changed the pace of terrorist operations. Perhaps most importantly, technology allowed Al-Qaeda to operate as a truly global organization for the first time in history. The technological revolution that was transforming legitimate businesses and governments was also revolutionizing terrorism. By the end of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda had become the world's first truly modern terrorist organization. In a mud brick compound hidden in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden sat cross-legged on a simple carpet, surrounded by a dozen men who had traveled from around the world to meet him. It was late 1998, and these men represented Al-Qaeda cells in countries from Germany to the Philippines. But this gathering represented something unprecedented in the history of terrorism, a truly global organization that could plan and execute coordinated attacks across multiple continents, while remaining largely invisible to the world's intelligence agencies. They had come to receive orders, report on their activities, and help plan what would become the most devastating terrorist attack in history. The meeting looked simple enough from the outside, just a group of bearded men drinking tea and discussing religious matters in the flickering light of oil lamps. At the top was a small leadership council called the Shura, which made major strategic decisions about targets, timing, and resource allocation. Below the Shura were specialized committees responsible for military operations, financial management, media relations, and religious guidance. This structure allowed Al-Qaeda to maintain unified strategic direction while giving local cells the flexibility to adapt to conditions in their particular countries. A cell in Hamburg could plan an operation very differently from a cell in Karachi, but both would be working toward the same overall objectives. Bin Laden's personal fortune, estimated at over $300 million, provided the initial capital, but Al-Qaeda quickly developed multiple revenue streams. Al-Qaeda had not started as a sophisticated international network. Drawing on his business background and his experience managing his family's construction empire, he began to build Al-Qaeda like a multinational corporation. Al-Qaeda developed sophisticated fundraising networks that tapped into the same charitable impulses that supported legitimate humanitarian causes. Wealthy Gulf businessmen who donated money to help Afghan orphans or Palestinian refugees often had no idea that their contributions were being diverted to fund terrorist training camps. In Afghanistan, agricultural operations that exported honey and other products, and investments in banks and trading companies, these businesses provided both income and cover for terrorist activities, allowing operatives to travel and communicate under the guise of normal commercial activity. These groups had been established for legitimate purposes and did provide real, humanitarian aid to Muslim communities around the world. The captured operatives could only reveal information about their own activities and the few people they had direct contact with. They could not betray the entire network because they simply did not know how it was organized. But Al-Qaeda operatives infiltrated many of these organizations, using them as fronts for money laundering and terrorist recruitment, instead of a traditional pyramid structure where orders flowed down from the top. The organization operated more like a network of interconnected cells. The organization established camps in Afghanistan that served as finishing schools for international terrorists. Young men would arrive as raw recruits motivated by religious passion but lacking practical skills. They would leave as trained operatives capable of blending into any society and carrying out sophisticated attacks. Groups in different countries could declare their allegiance to bin Laden and adopt the Al-Qaeda name without requiring direct control from the central leadership. This gave Al-Qaeda a global presence without the overhead of managing operations in dozens of countries. Each cell knew only what it needed to know to carry out its specific mission. The organization understood that terrorism was fundamentally a form of communication. The goal was not just to kill people and destroy property, but to send a message that would influence the behavior of much larger populations. The organization would have subsidiaries in different countries, specialized departments for different functions. and a hierarchy that could make decisions and coordinate activities across vast distances. Recruits were taught that they were soldiers in a holy war that would determine the future of Islam. These videos combined religious sermons, news footage, and dramatic reenactments to create a compelling narrative about the struggle between Islam and its enemies. Attacking the World Trade Center was not just about destroying buildings and killing people. It was about striking at symbols of American economic power and demonstrating that even the mightiest nation on earth was vulnerable to attack. They were convinced that dying in battle would guarantee them immediate entry into paradise. They formed bonds of brotherhood with fellow trainees that would last for the rest of their lives. Operatives learned how to detect surveillance and how to abort operations if they suspected they had been compromised. They were trained to destroy evidence and maintain cover stories even under interrogation. It was simultaneously a religious movement, a multinational corporation, and a military organization. It combined ancient Islamic theology with modern business practices and cutting-edge technology. It was capable of inspiring individual believers to carry out suicide attacks, while also planning and executing operations of stunning complexity and coordination. All that remained was to select the target and set the plan in motion. They looked for young men who were religiously devout, personally alienated, and psychologically susceptible to radical ideas. Recruits learned how to establish false identities, how to communicate securely, how to conduct surveillance without detection, how to manage financial resources. They studied the security procedures of different countries and learned how to exploit weaknesses in border controls and law enforcement. Instead, they were slowly introduced to increasingly radical ideas through religious study groups, political discussions, and exposure to propaganda materials. Only after months or years of indoctrination were the most promising candidates invited to travel to training camps. When bin Laden first established the organization in 1988, it was little more than a registry of Arab fighters who had served in Afghanistan. They avoided unnecessary contact with each other and compartmentalized information, so that no individual knew more than was absolutely necessary for his specific role. They returned to their home countries or traveled to new destinations where they established cells, recruited new members, and waited for orders to carry out attacks. Many worked normal jobs and lived conventional lives while secretly preparing for operations that might not begin for years. The name Al-Qaeda, which means the base, or the foundation in Arabic, reflected its humble origins as a database of mujahideen veterans who might be called upon for future conflicts. But bin Laden had always envisioned something much larger. The corporate structure that bin Laden created was both centralized and decentralized. Each committee operated with considerable independence, but all reported ultimately to bin Laden himself. The financial structure of Al-Qaeda was particularly sophisticated. The organization operated like a venture capital firm, providing seed money for terrorist operations while expecting successful cells to become self-sustaining. Some Al-Qaeda money came from legitimate businesses. Bin Laden owned construction companies in Sudan. Other funding came from wealthy donors throughout the Islamic world. The most dangerous aspect of Al-Qaeda's financial network was its use of Islamic charities and relief organizations. The operational structure of Al-Qaeda was designed to be resilient against government counterterrorism efforts. This cellular structure meant that if one cell was discovered and its members arrested, the damage to the overall organization would be limited. Al-Qaeda also developed a franchise model that allowed affiliated groups to operate under the Al-Qaeda brand while maintaining local autonomy. The training system that Al-Qaeda developed was crucial to its success. The training curriculum covered much more than weapons and explosives. Perhaps most importantly, the camps provided ideological indoctrination that transformed religious motivation into operational commitment. The graduates of these training camps became the backbone of Al-Qaeda's global network. Al-Qaeda's media and propaganda operations were as sophisticated as its military and financial arms. The organization developed its own media production capabilities, creating professional quality videos that could compete with commercial television for production values and emotional impact. Al-Qaeda also mastered the art of symbolic targeting. The organization chose targets not just for their military or economic importance, but for their psychological impact. The recruitment methods that Al-Qaeda developed were equally sophisticated. The organization identified potential operatives through a network of mosques, religious schools, and charitable organizations. The recruitment process was gradual and carefully managed. Potential recruits were not immediately invited to join a terrorist organization. Al-Qaeda also developed sophisticated methods for maintaining operational security. Members used code names and communicated through encrypted channels. The organization developed elaborate procedures for dead drops, safe houses, and emergency communications. By the end of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of terrorism. The organization that bin Laden had built was perfectly designed to carry out the kind of spectacular attack that would announce Al-Qaeda's presence to the world and demonstrate that the age of mass casualty international terrorism had begun. On the morning of August 7, 1998, two massive explosions shattered the peaceful routine of East Africa. Within minutes of each other, truck bombs destroyed the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The attacks killed 224 people and wounded over 4,000 others. The embassy bombings were Al-Qaeda's first successful attack against American targets, and they announced to the world that a new kind of terrorist organization had emerged. These were not the random acts of local militants, but carefully planned operations that demonstrated global reach and sophisticated capabilities. Most of the victims were African civilians who happened to be near the embassy buildings when the bombs exploded. Sitting in his compound in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden watched television coverage of the destruction with satisfaction. Al-Qaeda could strike American targets anywhere in the world and escape before authorities knew what had happened. The attacks also provided valuable operational experience that would be crucial for planning even larger operations in the future. The embassy attacks had been years in the making. Al-Qaeda operatives had spent months conducting surveillance, recruiting local accomplices, and preparing explosive devices. Attacks had required extensive local support and careful planning. But they had also exposed the organization to significant risks. Several operatives were arrested in the aftermath, and intelligence agencies around the world began paying much more attention to Al-Qaeda activities. He began planning attacks that would rely less on local recruits and more on operatives who had been trained in Afghanistan and could blend into Western societies without suspicion. The attack killed 17 American sailors, nearly sank one of the most advanced warships in the U.S. Navy. The attackers had conducted months of surveillance and preparation, establishing a safe house near the port and purchasing a boat and explosives without attracting attention. They had established front companies to purchase vehicles and rent safe houses. They had created false identities and cover stories that allowed them to move freely through Kenya and Tanzania without attracting attention from local security forces. He began planning an operation that would force America to either escalate dramatically or appear to retreat in defeat. Either outcome would serve Al-Qaeda's purposes by proving to the Islamic world that America could be challenged and defeated. The original concept came from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, a Pakistani engineer who had been involved in earlier terrorist plots, including the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. President Clinton was in his final months in office and facing impeachment proceedings over his personal scandals. But as Al-Qaeda's capabilities grew and the organization gained experience from the embassy and coal attacks, the airline plot began to seem more feasible. In 1999, bin Laden had given his approval for the operation and authorized Mohammed to begin detailed planning. Previous Al-Qaeda attacks had relied on suicide bombers who needed only basic training and religious motivation. The airline hijacking plan required operatives who could live undetected in American society for months or years while learning to pilot commercial aircraft. Many of the eventual hijackers were university students or professionals who spoke English and had experience living outside their home countries. They were chosen not just for their religious commitment, but for their ability to function in American society. The leader of this group was Mohammed Atta, an Egyptian architecture student who had become increasingly radicalized during his years in Germany. The incoming administration of George W. Bush was focused on other priorities and did not immediately develop a comprehensive strategy for dealing with Al-Qaeda. They were selected to lead the airline hijacking operation and began intensive training in combat tactics, religious indoctrination, and operational security. They learned to fly small aircraft at flight schools in Germany and later traveled to the United States to receive training on commercial aircraft simulators. They established themselves in American communities, renting apartments, opening bank accounts, and creating the appearance of normal lives while secretly preparing for their attack. Previous terrorist attacks had often claimed to distinguish between military and civilian targets. But al-Qaeda made no such distinctions. The operation was originally planned to include hijackings of additional aircraft, but bin Laden ultimately decided to limit the attack to 4 planes to reduce the risk of discovery. The plan was audacious in its scope and complexity, requiring years of preparation and dozens of operatives working in coordination across multiple countries. The hijackers managed to take control of 4 commercial aircraft and crash them into the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks, making September 11th the deadliest terrorist attack in history. For the first time, America had been attacked on its own soil by foreign enemies since the War of 1812. The attacks shattered Americans' sense of security and invulnerability, proving that even the world's most powerful country was vulnerable to determined terrorists. These men were chosen for their physical strength and religious fanaticism, rather than their ability to blend into American society. The attacks proved that a small group of dedicated operatives could inflict massive damage on a superpower using nothing more than box cutters and commercial aircraft. They demonstrated that modern technology and open societies created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by clever and determined enemies. They received basic training in combat techniques and were taught just enough English to follow orders during the hijackings. The hijackers conducted surveillance flights to study aircraft procedures and security measures. The United States invaded Afghanistan, destroyed al-Qaeda's training camps, and killed or captured most of the organization's leadership. Understanding these factors is crucial for preventing similar attacks in the future and for addressing the underlying conditions that make extremist ideologies attractive to potential recruits. The story of al-Qaeda's rise serves as a warning about how small groups can exploit modern vulnerabilities to threaten entire civilizations. The global war on terror that followed September 11th made it much more difficult for terrorist organizations to operate internationally. They purchased airline tickets for flights that would provide maximum symbolic impact and destructive potential. It had continued through the development of radical ideologies, the flow of Saudi money and religious extremism, the creation of international networks of veterans from various conflicts, and the exploitation of failed states as safe havens. In bin Laden's view, all Americans were legitimate targets in the holy war he was waging. Anti-American sentiment, fueled by various foreign policy grievances, had created a vast pool of potential recruits. The organizational innovations that transformed al-Qaeda from a simple database into a sophisticated international network had made possible operations of unprecedented scale and complexity. The success of the embassy bombings proved to bin Laden that his strategy was working. President Bill Clinton responded to the embassy bombings with cruise missile strikes against al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan that American intelligence claimed was producing chemical weapons. The attacks killed some al-Qaeda operatives but missed bin Laden himself, who had left his compound just hours before the missiles arrived. The missile strikes made bin Laden famous throughout the Islamic world as the man who had forced America to respond with military force. Recruitment to al-Qaeda training camps increased dramatically as young Muslims sought to join the organization that had successfully attacked the world's most powerful country. The American retaliation actually helped al-Qaeda more than it hurt the organization. The embassy bombings also taught al-Qaeda important lessons about conducting terrorist operations. Bin Laden realized that future operations would need to be even more sophisticated to avoid detection and capture. The next major al-Qaeda operation came on October 12, 2000, when a small boat loaded with explosives rammed into the USS Cole, an American destroyer that was refueling in the port of Aden in Yemen. The Cole attack demonstrated al-Qaeda's growing operational capabilities. The operation had been planned and executed entirely by al-Qaeda operatives without relying on local terrorist groups. More importantly, the Cole attack showed that al-Qaeda was willing to directly target American military personnel. The American response to the Cole attack was much more limited than the response to the embassy bombings. This limited response convinced bin Laden that America was weak and unwilling to fight a sustained campaign against his organization. The planning for what would become the September 11th attacks began in the mid-1990s, even before the embassy bombings. Mohammed approached bin Laden with a plan to hijack commercial airliners and crash them into prominent American landmarks. Bin Laden initially rejected the plan as too ambitious and risky. The September 11th plot required a new type of terrorist operative. Al-Qaeda began recruiting educated, middle-class Muslims who could blend into Western society without attracting suspicion. The most important recruits came from Hamburg, Germany, where a group of Arab students had formed a radical cell centered around the Al-Quds Mosque. Atta and several of his friends traveled to Afghanistan in late 1999, where they met with bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda leaders. The Hamburg cell members returned to Germany and began preparing for their mission. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda recruited additional operatives from Saudi Arabia to serve as muscle for the hijacking teams. The final planning for September 11th took place during 2001 as the various elements of the plot came together. Al-Qaeda leadership made final decisions about timing and targets during meetings in Afghanistan and Malaysia. The September 11th attacks succeeded beyond Al-Qaeda's wildest expectations. The psychological impact of the attacks was even greater than their immediate destruction. The success of September 11th validated Al-Qaeda's strategy and inspired copycat organizations around the world. But the attacks also triggered a massive American response that would ultimately lead to Al-Qaeda's near destruction. The path to September 11th had begun with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and the international response that created the first generation of global jihadist fighters. The technological revolution of the 1990s had provided terrorists with unprecedented capabilities for communication and coordination. September 11th was not an isolated event, but the culmination of trends and developments that had been building for more than 20 years.